Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something that sounds, well, almost impossible. Imagine a huge modern city, think New York, London, Tokyo, just humming along, trading, politicking, building amazing things. But picture it without a single professional police officer on the payroll, not one.
Yeah, it completely goes against how we think states work, doesn't it? We just
Right.
assume you need that central force to keep order. But that, essentially, was the setup in classical Athens, a massive, bustling city, birthplace of democracy, packed with tens of thousands of people, citizens, immigrants, slaves, and no police force as we'd recognize it.
And that's the paradox, the real tension we want to unpack today. We're doing a deep dive based on the sources that describe this unique, almost patchwork system they had for social control. Our mission, really, is to explore how they use law, yes, but also intense social pressure instead of a state police force to keep things stable. And hopefully, you'll have that aha moment realizing that keeping order wasn't the state's job. It was a personal, often expensive, and frankly, risky duty for every single citizen.
Exactly. And we're going to look really closely at how this whole citizen-led system dealt with the most serious crime imaginable, homicide. I mean, what actually happens when it's the victim's family, not some state detective agency who has to track down the killer?
Okay, so let's start with that big hole right in the middle of Athenian society, the missing police force. The sources are, well, pretty unanimous on this. Classical Athens just didn't have an organized professional law enforcement system like ours.
Right. Now, they did have something you sometimes hear about the Scythian Archers. These were basically publicly owned slaves, a small group, quite visible,
Hmm.
but their job was mostly crowd control, keeping order at the assembly, dealing with public disturbances maybe. They weren't detectives. They weren't out patrolling neighborhoods. They certainly weren't equipped to investigate serious crimes or hunt down dangerous criminals. The state just didn't employ officers for that kind of work.
So if I'm the victim of a crime, say someone attacks me, or worse, harms my family, I can't just call the Athenian equivalent of 911 and expect detectives to show up.
No, afraid not. You absolutely have to take the lead yourself. It's what scholars often call a self-help justice system. The whole burden, finding out what happened, gathering evidence, figuring out who did it, and then actually bringing the case to court, that all falls squarely on you, the injured party, or your family.
And you mentioned homicide. That's where this self-help idea gets really intense, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. For murder, the responsibility wasn't just optional. It was a core legal and even religious obligation placed directly on the victim's immediate family or closest relatives.
It wasn't just their right to seek justice, it was their duty.
Precisely. They were legally required to conduct the investigation and then prosecute the accused using a specific, very ancient procedure called the dikophonou, the homicide prosecution.
Oh.
This process supposedly went way back, maybe even to Draco. Think about the implications, though. The family has to act like a modern police unit, a forensics team, and the district attorney's office, all rolled into one. And they have to do it using their own time, their own money, and let's not forget, potentially putting themselves in real danger.
Wait a minute. If the family is legally obligated, what happens if they're just too scared? Or too poor? I mean, what if the suspected killer is some wealthy aristocrat? Or a powerful political figure? Isn't the whole system just fall apart if the people responsible for driving it are intimidated or can't afford it?
That's the inherent weakness, the fragility right there.
Yeah.
The law might demand prosecution, but reality often meant you had to pick your battles very carefully. And we see clear examples where political situations put immediate, serious limits on who could even be prosecuted in the first place.
You're talking about the amnesty, right? After the democracy was restored, after 403 BC?
Exactly that. After the brutal rule of the 30 tyrants, Athens was just desperate to avoid more civil war and chaos. They needed stability. So to stop endless revenge killings disguised as legal prosecutions, they passed this amnesty, and it dramatically limited homicide cases going forward. It restricted them specifically to killers who acted by their own hand, the autocare.
Okay, let me get this straight. So if I say, hired a hitman to kill my rival during the oligarchy under the restored democracy, I, the mastermind, the one who planned it, I'm safe because of the amnesty, but the poor guy who actually did the deed, the auto care, he could still be prosecuted by the victim's family.
That's precisely it. And understanding the distinction autocare versus planning or conspiracy, which they called boulousis, is absolutely key to grasping Athenian justice after this period. The system prioritized clear, direct action. It focused justice very narrowly, partly for political reasons to keep the peace. The state basically said, look, We'll uphold the ancient right to prosecute the person who physically did the killing, but we have to draw a line. We cannot allow prosecutions for conspiracy or planning, Belusis, related to the recent political turmoil." End quote. This kept justice focused on, well, tangible private wrongs, and stopped the courts from becoming a free-for-all for settling old political scores.
Okay, that makes a kind of brutal political sense. But wow, does it leave some huge gaps in the justice system? It means really high-profile murders, especially political assassinations, could just disappear, go unsolved, simply because the state had no mechanism to investigate them properly.
And we have a perfect, quite chilling example of that. The murder of Ephialtes.
The reformer,
Yeah.
the one who took power away from the Areopagus Council.
The very same. A hugely important political figure. He was a main opponent of the conservative Areopagites. He was assassinated maybe in broad daylight, maybe at night. The details are murky.
He definitely had enemies, powerful ones.
Absolutely. Loads of them, especially the people whose power he'd just curtailed. But here's the thing. Despite who he was, the sources are quite clear. They say something like, no one ever ascertained with surety who the murderers were. The case just went cold, vanished. Why? No state detective agency. And Ephialtes' family, probably terrified, caught right in the middle of a huge political struggle. They likely didn't dare point fingers at powerful suspects. So when that private engine of justice the family stalled, the case just died. It really shows you how fragile order could be, even in the heart of Athenian democracy. A major political assassination just gets filed under unsolved mystery.
Okay, so the state wasn't investigating, and the main traditional path for homicide, the dike phonu, was ancient, maybe a bit rigid, and definitely constrained by things like the amnesty. But Athenians were famously, well, litigious. They liked going to court, so they must have needed other tools, maybe more flexible ones, to pursue justice, right?
They did. And this brings us to another key procedure, something called appagoge.
Appagoge, what does that mean?
It literally means something like leading away or taking away. It was basically the main way a private citizen could make a summary arrest. Unlike the dike phonu, which is this very formal step-by-step process rooted in tradition, appagoge was fast. If you caught a criminal, say red-handed,
In the act.
exactly, a autophoroi, caught in the act, you, as a citizen, could physically seize them and drag them immediately before the relevant magistrates, usually a board called the 11, for a quick judgment or at least detention.
That sounds quite direct, almost like legalized citizen's arrest, but maybe with more immediate consequences.
It was definitely legalized self-help, yeah.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that our sources suggest this procedure wasn't static. It was still developing, evolving. The city seemed to be adapting it to cope with its legal needs precisely because it lacked a police force. We see hints that its use was expanding, for instance, to cover suspected killers, like in a famous case involving someone named Euxethius. It shows the legal system trying to give citizens these immediate, quite powerful tools to grab wrongdoers, kind of compensating for the state's weakness in enforcement.
Right, but you mentioned that key requirement, catching them autophore in the act. If the procedure was evolving, surely the definition of in the act must have been up for debate. I mean, did you literally have to catch the guy holding the bloody knife, or could lawyers, stretch that definition a bit?
Oh, absolutely. That definition, what exactly counted as caught in the act, became a huge legal battleground, especially in politically charged cases. Think about it. If the definition was super narrow, appagogy would be pretty useless for anything complex, like political crimes or conspiracies where the act wasn't a single simple event. But if it was too broad, the whole process could become chaotic, easily abused for personal vendettas.
Okay, so where do we see this definition being pushed?
The trial of Agoratus is the classic example here. Lysias prosecuted him. Agoratus was this notorious informer who worked with the 30 tyrants. His denunciations led to the deaths of several citizens.
Right, I remember this connects back to the amnesty. Agoratus didn't kill people with his own hand. He informed on them, conspired against them.
Exactly. His crime was belusis, conspiracy, and informing, using his position under the tyranny to get others executed. One of his victims was a man named Dionysiodorus.
So why didn't Dionysiodorus' relatives just use the standard dike phono against Agoratus?
Because of the amnesty constraint we talked about. The amnesty specifically protected people from prosecution for belusis related to actions during the oligarchy. If the relatives had gone the dike phono route, they would have started the process before the magistrate responsible for homicides, the basilis. And the basilis, seeing that the charge was effectively belusis linked to the 30 tyrants, would have been legally obligated by the amnesty agreement to just throw the case out right then and there. Dismissed. End of story.
Okay. So using appagoge was a clever workaround. But how on earth could they argue that Agoratus, the informer, was caught in the act of killing? He wasn't holding a weapon.
That's where the legal ingenuity comes in. They chose appagoge precisely because its definition of in the act was more fluid, more open to interpretation, especially compared to the strict auto-care rule under the amnesty for decapano. Lysias, the prosecutor, basically had to argue that Agoratus, having been physically seized by citizens after the tyranny fell, was still in the act of being a killer, that his past collaboration and the ongoing consequences of his informing constituted a continuous state of criminality that justified using appagoge.
Wow.
Yeah, the choice of procedure wasn't about finding some abstract truth. It was a calculated technical move. It was designed specifically to bypass the basileus and get the case directly before a jury via the 11, avoiding the immediate dismissal mandated by the amnesty. It really highlights how Athenian justice was often about navigating these complex procedural rules, using citizen-driven cleverness to try and achieve some form of accountability when the direct path was blocked.
It's just staggering that the whole system relied so heavily on citizens knowing the rules, pushing the boundaries, taking the initiative. And this decentralized approach, it wasn't just for big crimes like murder, was it? It seems to have extended even into like family squabbles and domestic issues.
Oh, definitely. Even for disputes that we consider purely private today, the Athenians often preferred specialized, citizen-led judgment instead of dragging everything into the public courts. Plato's Laws, for example, gives us some interesting glimpses.
Like what?
Well, he describes a situation where, say, one brother wounds another in a fit of anger. Who judges that? Not the city magistrates initially.
So who then?
The primary judges, according to Plato's model at least, were the parents and the wider family kindred of both sexes. The idea was to keep that kind of deep internal conflict within the family sphere, the oikos. Only if that initial family judgment was disputed would they perhaps escalate it, first to the male relatives, and only as a last resort, maybe to the official guardians of the law. It shows a real reluctance for the state to meddle in family matters, unless absolutely necessary. Citizens were expected to handle their own.
And this private power even extended to how they dealt with slaves, right? If a slave hit a free person.
Yes, another clear example. If a slave struck a free man in anger, the law, as described, didn't involve state officers stepping in to arrest the slave. Instead, the slave's master was legally obligated to hand the slave over directly to the injured freeman.
The victim basically takes custody.
Essentially, yes. The victim then apparently had the right to deal with the slave as they saw fit, within certain bounds, presumably. The master acted as the enforcer against their own property, delivering the slave. The victim then became the immediate enforcer of the law concerning bodily injury. If the master refused to hand the slave over, maybe claiming the accusation was false or colluded, they could contest it. But if they failed to deliver the slave or win their case, the master themselves faced heavy fines, often double or even 4 times the damages assessed for the injury. Again, the whole system hinges on private citizens taking action, the victim demanding redress, the master enforcing accountability on their slave, or facing penalties themselves.
Okay, so this intense reliance on private citizens taking action, investigating, prosecuting, even handling punishment, sometimes it really brings us to the heart of how Athenian society maintained order, doesn't it? Since the state wasn't out there patrolling or investigating routinely or enforcing compliance in a systematic way, something else must have filled that vacuum.
Absolutely. And that something else was less tangible than police stations and uniforms, but maybe in some ways even more powerful.
Yeah.
It was enormous social and moral pressure. You see this tension playing out in their culture. There's this underlying conflict, this shift happening from the old ways focused purely on the family unit, the oikos, towards the broader demands and identity of the democratic city-state, the polis. Justice itself had to evolve, right? From being primarily about blood ties, family honor, and vengeance, it had to become something more civic, something about maintaining order for the whole community.
And their art reflects this struggle, doesn't it? I'm thinking of Aeschylus's Oresteia trilogy. That's pretty much the textbook example, right?
It really is. That trilogy dramatizes the whole transition. It starts with a cycle of revenge killings within the House of Atreus, very much an oikos-based blood feud.
Yeah.
And it culminates in the goddess Athena establishing the first Athenian law court, the Areopagus court, right there in the city center, under the polis's authority.
So it's like the origin story of Athenian law, moving justice from the family hearth to the public square.
Exactly. It marks that symbolic moment where the responsibility for justice, that ancient duty of vengeance, gets formally handed over from the family to the civic structures of the polis. But, and this is a point we keep coming back to, while the authority shifts to the city, the actual mechanism for making it happen that stays decentralized. It still rests entirely on the individual citizens stepping up and activating those city courts.
Right, so the state didn't suddenly create a police force to take over the hard work. It just said, okay, citizens, now you have to prosecute wrongdoers in the city's name, using the city's rules in the city's courts, which must have been complicated and risky.
Definitely. And in that kind of environment where the whole system depends on citizens doing their part,
Hmm.
the idea of being a bad citizen becomes a much, much bigger deal than it might be for us today. It wasn't just frowned upon, it could be seen as a direct threat to the city's survival.
A threat, how?
Well, if order, and crucially military strength, depended on everyone participating willingly, then things like cowardice in battle or corruption, or especially dodging military service,
Hmm.
these weren't just personal failings. They were seen as undermining the whole collective project. The state needed every citizen to be engaged, vigilant, and willing to fulfill their duties.
Let's take the military example. Draft evasion. Was that common? Was it easy to do?
It seems it was certainly tempting and probably quite possible. The system for calling up troops, the catalogos, wasn't always super strict or efficient. It relied on lists and local officials. So yeah, a man could potentially try to fabricate an excuse for exemption or maybe just, not be where he was supposed to be when the call-up happened.
So without a strong military police to round up shirkers, how did they ensure they had enough soldiers?
Again, it comes down to social pressure. Since the army was basically a citizen levy, not a professional standing army, they couldn't rely on constant, rigid enforcement. So what filled the gap? Constant public emphasis on duty, honor, and courage. And maybe even more powerfully, the fear of shame. The absolute terror of being publicly disgraced, labeled a cowarddelia. That social condemnation was likely the most effective tool they had to ensure compliance where the official conscription process might be a bit leaky.
That fear of public shame must have been intense, especially when accusations like cowardice could be used as political weapons. You mentioned Demosthenes earlier. The famous orator kept getting accused of cowardice by his rivals.
Exactly, because that accusation wasn't just name-calling. It struck right at the core of his legitimacy as a citizen and a leader. If the whole system relies on the moral character and reliability of its citizens, then accusing a prominent politician of lacking courage or self-control was basically an attempt to say, this man is fundamentally unfit to participate in public life, let alone lead us. It was an attack on his civic virtue.
And this idea of bad citizenship wasn't just about military duty, was it? It applied to financial obligations, too, especially for the wealthy.
Oh, absolutely. The rich Athenian citizens had specific duties called liturgies. These were incredibly expensive public services they were required to fund out of their own pockets.
Like what kind of services?
The big ones were things like funding the training and upkeep of a tragic chorus for the big drama festivals, or, even more costly, equipping and maintaining a trireme, one of their warships, for a year.
Wow, that sounds like a huge amount of money.
It was. We're talking potentially fortunes, tens of thousands of drachmas. So naturally, wealthy citizens had, as one source puts it, plenty of mundane and selfish motivations to try and dodge these liturgies if they could. And the city had a problem. It didn't really have a sophisticated bureaucracy, like an ancient IRS, to accurately figure out exactly who was rich enough to afford a liturgy, or who among the wealthy was richest and should therefore pay the most or take on the most burdensome ones. They couldn't easily prove ability to pay or distribute the load perfectly fairly based on detailed wealth assessments.
So, another gap in state capacity, how did they compel the rich to pay up then? More social pressure.
Social pressure played a role, sure, but they also had this unique, quite extraordinary legal procedure called the antidosis.
The antidosis, what was that?
It translates roughly as exchange. Imagine you're a wealthy Athenian, and you've just been assigned a really expensive liturgy, like funding that trireme. You think it's unfair. You look across the agora and you see another citizen, let's call him Clean Shoes, who you're convinced is actually wealthier than you are and should be doing this liturgy instead. You can initiate the antidosis against Clean Shoes.
Okay, so I challenge him. What happens then? Does he just have to take the liturgy?
Not necessarily. You give him a choice. Say, Clean Shoes, either you take over the liturgy from me right now, or you agree to swap your entire estate, your land, your workshops, your slaves, everything with my entire estate.
Oh, swap everything.
Everything. If Clean Shoes accepts the swap, he gets your supposedly smaller property, and the liturgy goes along with it. If he refuses the swap, basically saying, no way, you're richer than me, then the whole dispute goes to a jury trial. And the jury's job isn't just to decide who does the liturgy. Their primary task is to determine which one of you you or clean shoes, is actually the wealthier individual.
That's incredible. It's like a high-stakes legal duel fought with bank statements and property deeds.
It's exactly like fiscal dueling. It's a brilliant, if slightly terrifying, example of how Athens' outsourced state functions to citizen initiative. The state administration was too weak to police wealth distribution effectively. So instead, it weaponized the competitiveness and self-interest of the rich citizens themselves. It created a powerful incentive for wealthy individuals to keep an eye on each other's finances and challenge those they thought weren't pulling their weight. If you initiated an antidosis and lost meaning, the court decided you were actually richer, you kept the liturgy, and potentially faced social disgrace. If you were challenged and refused to swap, and then the court found you were richer, you had to take on the liturgy. The stakes were enormous. It was a mechanism for enforcing the financial contributions of the elite, policed by the elite themselves.
Okay, so it's becoming really clear just how much Athenian stability depended on this fragile, decentralized system. It needed citizens to be willing to sue each other, to physically arrest people, even to engage in these high-stakes financial challenges like the antidosis. That's a lot to ask of people. It seems like there must have been some deeper, maybe philosophical or moral reason why citizens would embrace this burden, this constant potential for conflict and risk.
I think you're right. And this is where the Athenian focus on morality, on striving for what they called takakala, the noble or beautiful things, really comes into play. That commitment to civic order seems deeply intertwined with their ethical ideals. Pursuing a noble life, the Kalan life, wasn't just a personal goal. It was often framed as the only truly justifiable way for an active citizen to live. It provided the sort of internal motivation needed to actually endure the costs and dangers of participating so fully in the life of the polis.
And we see philosophers picking up on this, right? Like Socrates emphasizing self-mastery.
Exactly. Socrates famously stressed how crucial self-mastery, or self-control, in Kritia was. He argued it was the only thing that gives you the necessary endurance to pursue and appreciate the enjoyments worth remembering. End quote. Now that might sound purely personal, but think about its civic dimension. If you lack self-mastery, if you're ruled by your desires, your fears, your laziness, how are you going to function as a reliable Athenian citizen? You're going to be the guy who dodges the draft. You'll find excuses to avoid your liturgy. You'll probably shy away from the risk and expense of prosecuting that powerful neighbor who wronged your family. So the citizen who strives for Kelon, who practices self-mastery, is the one who's internally dependable. They're the ones who can be counted on to endure the hardships, face the dangers, pay the costs. They're reliable as a soldier, as a potential prosecutor, as a public servant. It's the moral foundation for active citizenship.
Ah, okay. That really sheds light on why political leaders were under such intense scrutiny for their personal conduct. If the whole system depends on the moral reliability of its citizens, especially its leaders, then any hint of failure, cowardice, corruption, lack of self-control wasn't just gossip, it was politically damaging.
Totally fatal, potentially.
Yeah.
When Demosthenes' rivals kept hammering him with charges of cowardice, they weren't just trying to embarrass him. They were making a fundamental argument about his character. They were saying, this man lacks the core virtue, the self-mastery required to embody the ideals of the polis. How can he lead us if he can't even control his own fear? The standard was incredibly high, and failures were very public.
And it seems this emphasis on character and civic virtue is even reflected in how they remembered their great historical figures. Like Solon, the famous lawgiver. He wasn't primarily remembered as a conquering hero, was he?
No. His enduring reputation, his title almost, was dialactos, the reconciler.
The reconciler. Why was that so important?
Because his greatest achievement wasn't military victory or building monuments. It was political. He was credited with pulling Athens back from the brink of civil war, stasis, by mediating between the warring factions, the rich and the poor, the nobles and the commoners. He did it through constitutional reforms, debt cancellation, establishing a more equitable system.
Okay, but how does Solon the Reconciler connect back to our discussion about policing, or the lack thereof?
It reinforces the idea that for Athenians, political solutions, finding ways to create fairness, build consensus, maintain civic harmony, were seen as fundamentally more important for long-term stability than simply relying on physical force or enforcement. They seem to understand, perhaps implicitly, that their fragile system of citizen-led justice could only really function if the underlying community wasn't tearing itself apart. If the city descended into widespread stasis, that decentralized system wouldn't work. It would just collapse back into private violence and vendetta. So maintaining order was primarily seen as a political and moral project, building a just and cohesive society, rather than just a logistical problem solvable by hiring more guards.
It's a society where politics and ethics weren't separate from law and order. They were actually its foundation.
Yeah, that's a radically different way of thinking about it compared to today. Hashtag outro. Well, we've certainly taken a deep dive today into the, let's say, gritty reality of life in classical Athens. A city we often picture with marble temples and philosophers debating, but where order was maintained through this demanding, decentralized, high-stakes system, a system relying entirely on citizens stepping up initiating private prosecutions like the dike or the more fluid apagoge, engaging in financial duels like the antidosis, and all of it held together by this intense web of social expectation and moral pressure.
Yeah, and the big takeaway here, for you listening, is really about the nature of Athenian citizenship itself. Keeping order wasn't something the government just did for people. It was a direct, heavy, and constant burden carried by every active citizen. You, as an individual, were potentially always involved in the justice system, and your family might bear the entire cost, financial, emotional, physical, of doing what we now consider the state's job, investigating and prosecuting serious crime.
That shift they dramatized, from the old ways of family vengeance, the oikos, to the city's formal law courts, the polis that wasn't just a neat story. It represented a fundamental, probably painful sacrifice that Athenian democracy demanded of its people. So, here's a final thought to chew on. If the stability of that remarkable self-governing society depended so utterly on citizens being willing to embrace the cost, the risk, the sheer hassle of litigation and public accountability, choosing that over easier private score settling, what does that tell us about the necessary sacrifices for any self-governing system, including our own, to truly function today? Is that kind of active, sometimes difficult citizenship still the price we have to pay for genuine self-rule?
Something to definitely mull over. Until our next deep dive,